Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling Mauritania. Maybe a country you haven't thought much about, but it's incredibly unique. Really a crossroads, isn't it, where the Arab and African worlds meet.
Absolutely, a constant convergence.
So we're using a really solid research piece, A Brief History of Mauritania by Associate Professor Dr. Afisavad Chayapolfet Siravatana Waravachara. It's quite comprehensive history, culture, economy, politics, the whole picture.
It is, yeah. A lot to unpack there.
Exactly. Our mission is to pull out the key takeaways for you, find those surprising bits, and help you get a real handle on Mauritania. Okay, let's dive in.
And I think if we connect this to the bigger picture, Mauritania's story is, well, it's a pretty stark example. It shows how these deep ethnic divisions can just keep undermining stability. Even when there are resources, it really changes what you think crossroads means.
That's a powerful way to frame it. Okay, so geography first. Mauritania is huge, over 1 million square kilometers.
Massive land area.
But here's the thing, 90% of that, it's Sahara Desert. Just
Oh, yeah.
vast desert.
Right, so it sits between the Sahara proper up north and the Sahel zone further south.
And the capital, Nouakchott, it's on the coast, but you go inland just a little bit and boom, desert, savanna.
Right, it's immediate.
And despite that size, not many people, just under 4 million back in 2016.
Yeah, very sparse.
And most people, like 80%, lived rurally then. Oh, and it's 100% Muslim. That's a key demographic point.
It is, and ethnically.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how these groups have shaped the place. You've got the majority Moors, speaking Hassaniya, which is an Arabic dialect.
Okay.
But then you also have large black African communities, the Pular, Senenkes, Wolofs.
Yeah.
They have their own languages.
Yeah.
Alongside French, which is still, widely used.
And the source doesn't shy away from the tensions, does it? It talks about relations of rancor, hostility, contempt, and mistrust, historically, culturally.
Yeah, those divides run deep. But at the same time, there's this continuous brassage, this intermingling.
Brassage.
Nice term. It is. Arab influences have been arriving since, well, practically the beginning of Christianity, wave after wave. And it's profoundly shaped everything, the culture, the social structure. Yeah. You see it in dance, music, literature, education, art, everywhere.
That mixing really sets up a unique history. So how far back do we need to go? Who were the first people there?
Well, you have to start with groups like the Moorish peoples,
Mhm.
mostly nomadic herders, camels, goats, sheep, cattle, organized by tribes, chieftains.
Okay.
And they had serfs, artisans attached to the tribes, doing things like small-scale farming or crafts. Then you had the Soninke, very influential too. They helped build smaller kingdoms, often tied into the big Ghana kingdom's trade routes and wealth.
Right, those early kingdoms, Udain, Duada, ruled by these Uzbad figures. The source mentions they had some pretty complex tech and military strategies.
Yeah, they accumulated wealth, had armies, but eventually they were kind of pushed aside by this reformist movement, the jihad, which was much more about direct warfare.
Okay, so we have these early kingdoms, the warfare. But Islam. How did Islam become so absolutely central? It started so far away.
Well, it wasn't just about faith spreading. It fundamentally shifted everything: politics, society, the economy, culture, intellectual life. It was a total transformation.
How did that happen?
Starting around the 11th century, you had Arab trader scholars moving across West Africa. They brought Islam, but also Arabic literacy. They introduced ideas like the ijaza, that's a scholar's certificate allowing them to teach.
Right.
And they established Quranic schools, the talibés, with students called talib. And what makes Mauritania stand out, according to the source, is it's the only Arab state south of the Sahara where Sharia law is followed in its, quote, purest and most rigorous form.
Wow. Purest and most rigorous. That's significant. And Mauritania wasn't isolated, right? It was connected to bigger empires.
Definitely. The eastern part was actually part of the Great Mali Empire for a time.
Oh.
And the source mentions the Sanhaja Berbers settling near places like Lake Makrua and Tikrit. They were big in the salt trade. And apparently when the Arabs arrived, they became known as enemies of the Black Kings.
Enemies of the Black Kings. Interesting phrase.
And this points to some really complex power dynamics that went on for ages, even after Mali. For instance, the research notes a period where a black population actually dominated Berbers and Arabs administratively for like 400 years.
4 centuries. Wow.
Yeah. And later, during colonial times, you had groups strategically claiming certain ancestries to deny land rights to others. It's a kind of historical manipulation based on ethnicity that's still debated and, frankly, criticized today by groups who lost out.
That makes sense. Okay, shifting gears. The colonial era. The Spanish were on the coast first, late 19th century.
That's right, coastal settlements. Then the French came in, Started peacefully, supposedly, around 1905, but it got military pretty quick by 1909. They'd already declared a protectorate over the coast in 1904.
So French control solidified, but then, after World War II, the push for independence, what really drove that?
It seems to be a couple of things. You had young Mauritanians coming back after fighting for France in the war.
Right.
And they started asking, why did we fight for their freedom when we're still colonized? Plus, students were demanding respect for the self-determination ideas they were being taught.
So France responded with a referendum in 1946.
Yeah, and it was controversial. The Mauritanians apparently rejected it overwhelmingly. The idea of just handing their destiny over to the French Republic. Unthinkable, the source says. They wanted a Senate instead.
So that rejection was kind of the first big step in the independence fight.
Seems like it. It pushed France to make some administrative concessions, trying to calm things down.
But it didn't stop the movement.
No, because France itself was getting weaker globally. A grassroots independence movement started growing, eventually pulling in local elites too. It became official in 1960. But the source is very clear. The first independence event, however, was violent. No one found a democratic alternative.
Not a peaceful transition then. Before we move fully into the modern era, any key figures we should know? There's Ba Mohammed Lachla mentioned from the 19th century.
Yeah, he was apparently quite well known. There's this anecdote about him dressing up as a French soldier, a tirailleur, for a photo, which popped up again around the year 2000.
Interesting. And post-independence, the founding president was Mukhtar Ould Daddah. Took power in late 1960.
Right. But his rule didn't last peacefully either. Overthrown in a coup in 1978.
Why was that?
Several reasons mentioned. Bad relations with France, failed attempts to grab territory in Guinea and Western Sahara, and just widespread corruption.
Okay, so summarizing that whole historical sweep, Mauritania was central to the trans-Saharan trade for centuries.
Huge role, yeah, from about 700 to 1500 CE, connecting North Africa and Senegal.
Influenced by the Almoravids, the Takrur Empire.
Right, and then those 17th century migrations driven by drought, infighting, the Fulani Jihad, that pushed Arab tribes south and brought black ethnic groups into the southern regions. It's just this constant movement and mixing of people and power.
Which brings us to the post-independence era, grappling with all that history. Daddah's African socialism didn't work out.
No, described as ineffective.
Yeah.
And then that 78 coup kicked off a period of real instability. The source says no fewer than 6 coups since then.
6 coups. Wow, that paints a picture.
And the underlying problems persist. Things like poor infrastructure, weak economic structures.
Right.
Combine that with a large population, lots of unemployment. It's basically fueled revolt after revolt.
And those ethnic tensions we mentioned earlier, they didn't just disappear after independence.
Far from it. The source points to the 1989 violence between Arab Moors and black Africans. Horrific bloodshed. 70,000 refugees fleeing to Senegal.
7.
And more uprisings in 91. These tensions are just everywhere. You see it in the derogatory language used, calling black Mauritanians pestilential, or marabout, meaning filthy, ignoble, and graffiti, anti-black, anti-Arab. It's raw.
That language is shocking.
It is. And to really grasp how deep it runs, there was that presidential candidate in 2002, Ould Madouna. He actually talked about needing to, quote, expunge the stain on the more homogeneity and paint the country white, meaning Arab.
Paint the country white. Good grief. That tells you everything about the depth of that division.
It really does. The source even compares it to the kind of ethnic conflict seen in places like Liberia and Sierra Leone. It's that fundamental to the country's identity and struggles.
So politically, there have been attempts to move away from military rule. Elections in '92.
Yes, a shift towards a multi-party system was attempted. Maouia Ould Sidi Amataya became president in '96, which was meant to signal the end of direct military control.
But it's complicated by things like the Western Sahara issue.
Hugely complicated. The Western Sahara conflict provided legitimacy for the military for a long time, and it was used as a tool to suppress internal dissent.
How so?
Well, the source calls the 1976 Moroccan invasion of what was then Spanish Sahara the most dramatic event. Fierce fighting, huge numbers of people displaced, 170,000 Sahrawi refugees ending up in Algeria.
Right.
And crucially, the research argues that the way the colonial powers drew lines and drove a wedge between the black African and Arab descendant populations. That rift, it says, has lasted and is basically the root cause of almost all the revolutions, coups, and civil wars in these mixed West Sudanese states.
So the colonial legacy is still playing out very directly. Okay, fast forward again. The last coup was 2008.
August 8th, 2008. And then inspired by the Arab Spring elsewhere, you got the 25 February youth movement in 2011, street protests against the government.
And the government reaction.
Arrests, attacks on activists, the usual playbook, sadly. The protesters use various tactics.
And human rights under the leader who took power in that coup, Mohammed Ould Abdelaziz. The picture isn't great.
No, the source lists quite a few concerns from that period. Increased media clampdowns, journalists arrested, arbitrary detentions, excessive force by security, torture allegations, peaceful protests repressed, opposition harassed.
Any specific examples?
Yeah, a press spokesman reportedly tortured and jailed, a pro-government journalist assassinated, a youth march where an activist was killed by tear gas. And at one point, they shut down the entire country's internet for 3 weeks.
3 weeks. Wow.
Yeah, it shows the pressure on free expression and assembly. And the press freedom ranking plummeted down to 94th out of 180 countries during his time.
So the current government under Mohammed Ould Ghazouani, it's facing its own challenges, even from university rectors.
Right. Allegations about election wins, blackmail, it's still contentious. But one change is social media. It seems to have opened up space for more open criticism, helped the opposition mobilize support in ways that were much harder before.
Interesting how technology changes things, but the core ethnic and social issues remain. The Arab-Berber groups holding power, the black groups often marginalized.
That's the picture painted, yes.
Oh.
The Arabs, often linked by this Tegnet lineage system, tend to dominate politics. The blacks, Soninke, Wolof, Pular, Haritans, often stuck in subsistence pastoralism, which makes them incredibly vulnerable to drought and famine.
And policies pushing Arabization and Islamization, Arabic script everywhere, focus on the Quran in schools.
Yes, and the source notes this can lead to kids dropping out early, limiting scientific education. Independent groups face scrutiny from Arabic-speaking sectarian outfits, and dissent often gets repressed.
Okay, let's talk economy. Mauritania has resources, right? Iron ore, oil, gold.
Absolutely. Minerals and fuel are like over 80% of exports. Iron ore is huge, offshore oil, gold, other hydrocarbons, plus fisheries and grazing lands.
So resource-rich,
Yeah.
but still struggling.
Very much so. The economy is super vulnerable to commodity price swings because it depends so much on mining and oil. Plus, there are structural weaknesses, high public debt, reliance on outside funding, underdeveloped financial markets. It does make you ask, how can a country with all that natural wealth still be among the least developed?
It's the classic resource curse question, isn't it?
Pretty much.
And other development hurdles. Youth bulge, unemployment, poverty.
All major issues. Poverty, malnutrition, fragility.
Yeah.
Getting access to basic services, good health, education, clean water, sanitation, electricity. It's hampered by lack of infrastructure and, frankly, not enough trained people.
And the environment isn't helping either. Increasing dryness, desertification.
Right, that's been getting worse since the 1930s. Deforestation, land degradation. Efforts to fight this haven't kept pace. The source blames things like population pressure, bad policies, unfair resource allocation, ignoring local needs.
And deforestation makes poverty worse.
Directly impacts production, yeah. Plus, local traditions and ways of managing resources have weakened. It's a tough cycle.
So, with all these challenges, what about the culture, the soul of Mauritania, this mix of Arab, Berber, African, Sahara values? What does that actually look like?
It's quite extraordinary. You see Arabo-Berber-Saharan values merging with Black African cultural values in art, in daily life. Think about oral poetry. It's sacred. Each tribe has its own praise poems.
Okay.
Music, instruments, songs, traditional crafts like woodwork and leather, and the architecture in old caravan cities like Chinguetti, Udan, Attar.
Those famous desert cities.
Exactly. Important stops on the old trade routes. You even see Gothic styles inherited from Moorish Spain, alongside unique sandstone structures in places like Odrar or painted caves. It's a really rich heritage.
And that heritage could be a draw for tourism.
Definitely. The source highlights different regions. Nouakchott has the coast, the desert nearby. Adrar is called Guests of the Great Desert. Udan, the Turjet Oasis, that weird geological hole feature.
Right, I've heard that.
And the Hod region has greener areas, a river, ancient history, lots of potential.
Shifting focus a bit. What about women in Mauritanian society? The Constitution recognizes rights, but
implementation is the problem. That's what the source says. Most women are illiterate or don't have equal access to education or jobs.
And the legal system?
It's dual Islamic and secular. And that often leads to discrimination, especially around divorce or inheritance. There was a gender equality law in 2010, but it's hampered by lack of resources and very conservative interpretations of Sharia law by lawyers and judges.
And poverty makes it worse. Harder to get legal help.
Exactly. Poverty is a huge barrier to accessing any kind of protection. Plus, there are other serious issues mentioned, like forced child labor and illegal fishing, and domestic violence becoming more common with urbanization.
Now, looking outwards, Mauritania's role in the region is kind of stuck between Algeria and Morocco, right?
Geopolitically, yes.
Yeah.
It tries to balance between them. It also cooperates on counterterrorism, which is a major concern.
Understandably.
State fragility, Islamic radicalism, these border issues, they all feed into security threats. And events like the Arab Spring in 2011 or the Mali crisis in 2012 really shifted Mauritania's foreign policy thinking and its view of security risks.
How so?
Made them much more concerned about instability spilling over the border from Mali, about radical groups gaining ground. If you look at the big picture, the source suggests Mauritania's internal politics, the slavery legacy, the ethnic distribution, creates this compromised situation where different groups are constantly maneuvering against each other.
Unlike, say, Morocco, which is more homogenous.
Exactly. It's a very different internal dynamic.
And it's affected by things like EU fishing agreements, agricultural exports.
Sure, external economic factors play a role. But internally, what's also interesting is the growing resilience of the opposition and media. They're using social media now for bottom-up mobilization.
Like those water protests in Nouakchott you mentioned.
Precisely. Even though apparently some opposition parties still have informal agreements not to push too hard on social grievances. It's complex.
Okay, so wrapping up. The future outlook. Still one of the poorest countries, despite the minerals and fish, often needing EU aid. Political history marked by dictatorships despite the democracy label.
That's the assessment. The 2008 coup is seen as a real watershed moment for understanding where things are now. But there's a potential game changer.
Which is?
Commodity prices are rising, favoring Mauritania's iron, gold, copper. But the really big one is offshore gas. It's becoming potentially key to global energy security, especially as Western countries look for alternative sources.
Yeah, the gas finds, right.
So what's fascinating is this huge potential for economic transformation, but also massive risks, given the country's history and divisions.
And President Ghazouani's government came in promising to fix things, tackle past issues, be more inclusive, close the development gap.
Those were the promises, yes.
So what's the final takeaway here? What's crucial for Mauritania moving forward?
Well, this really raises the question about the need for a clear strategy, a vision, tasks, methods, especially focusing on the underlying economy, the regulations, the governance around these new extractive industries like the gas. That's absolutely essential if they want to actually capture the benefits and not just fall into the same traps other resource-rich nations have.
Avoid the resource curse.
Exactly. Mauritania's position now might be more stable than some neighbors, arguably. But the integrity of its laws, regulations, checks, and balances, that's really under the microscope now.
What an incredible journey through Mauritania's layers. That unique cultural blend, the turbulent history, the complex challenges, and these emerging opportunities. It really underscores how much there is to understand about nations we don't often hear about. So what does this all mean for you listening to this? How do you think about nations navigating these deep historical legacies, potential economic booms, and that really tricky balance of diverse identities?
Maybe consider this. How Mauritania manages to reconcile its really deep ethnic tensions and historical divisions with this promise of new gas wealth, alongside the growing demands for democracy and accountability that won't just decide its future. It could offer really important lessons for the whole West Africa and Maghreb region. Can a country truly remake its future when it's still grappling so intensely with the complexities of its past?